So I'm a news junkie, but for the past few years, feeding that urge can be exhausting. There is so much vitriol and nonsense out there. And then I tune into Brian Lehrer, usually the podcast when I'm walking Frankie, our dog, and I get that rush of pleasure that comes from smart conversation about all kinds of things, the big headline grabbing stuff, but also the small stories that sometimes feel even more important and necessary. I knew what I wanted to ask Brian, but I also wanted to know what has made him so popular with younger generations. So I consulted with my son, Eli, and his pals, Izzy and Georgia, all three brand new public defense lawyers, all huge Brian Lehrer fans. They told me they appreciate the respect he shows guests, even when they ramble, and the graceful way he gets to the heart of their concerns. Plus, the way he asks tough questions in a fair way, and his ability to be lighthearted sometimes, connecting listeners to precious slices of New York City life. New York Magazine once put him on a list of dream dinner party guests. Well, we have him for lunch and are really happy. Welcome, Brian Lehrer. Hi. Hi there.
Hey, Julie, thank you for that very generous introduction. And hello, everybody.
Hi. So I have so many things to ask you, so let's start. So I'm always amazed at the huge variety of subjects that you cover. I mean, politics, yes, of course, but also insect invasions and stuff people find deposited by the curb and decide to take home, and, COVID, everything. And I wonder, just even the mechanics of the show, how do you decide what to talk about every day? How do guests get booked, and how do you prepare? I feel like you must never sleep. So how do you just put this whole amazing thing together every day?
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me for this. And I would start, I guess, by talking about the basic structure of what we do on a typical day. It does vary day to day depending on the news and depending on if we're doing some kind of special series. But typically, we have 4 segments over the 2 hours, and we usually start with something that's roughly national politics, and then something that's roughly local politics. Always we're looking for things that can involve the callers. So there might be things that are lead story worthy, but wouldn't necessarily lend themselves to group discussions and participation. So big national story, big local story. Then our third segment could be a deeper dive into something, anything. That might be a book interview. That might be, for example, in one of the weeks leading up to the Oscars, we're going to have all 5 directors of the nominated documentaries for Best Feature-Length Documentary, and play clips from the films and talk to them about that nonfiction work. And then usually our last segment is a call-in that can be one of those more lighthearted things, life in New York kinds of things. Yeah, you cited one that is a perfect example of it, which is things you found on the street that other people put out as garbage. So we're more or less working in that formula most days, but we'll also do series. We did a week-long series in that third segment on how 1993 set up the politics of 2023. We did that in January. So that's, just in a nutshell, sort of how we work day to day.
But then how do you prepare yourself? I mean, are you going to watch all 5 documentaries? Do you read out? I mean, it's a lot of ground to cover every day.
Right. I have a team of 5 producers, and, of course, it's a team sport, making the Brian Lehrer Show. And usually I do 2 preps a day myself, and producers do the other 2. So yes, homework is my life, but it is manageable.
Great. Okay. So I actually listened to this great interview you did, I think with the Gotham Gazette a few years ago on the 25th anniversary, and you talked at length about how you got started in this, and we probably don't have as much time as they did, but I'd love for you to just share with people, how you decided you wanted to be a radio show host. I mean, when you grew up.
Yeah, I mean, for some reason, it just kind of came over me, as a teenager. I mean, I can remember being 13 and which friend of mine said, hey, I listen to the radio because they have this great music on. And it was WABC and WMCA of that time, the top 40 hits. And I started listening. And I had grown up with music. My parents had me educated in music. I was a classically trained flute player growing up. But, I got into rock and roll like a lot of other kids, and R&B and the other things that were on hits radio when I was a teenager. And for some reason, I started branching out and listening to other things on the radio, talk shows in the middle of the night, if I was up in the middle of the night, Long John Nebel, whatever. And even on the rock stations, there was a guy named Alex Bennett who did like a 2 a.m. talk show on WPLJ, which was an album rock station. And I was like, oh, this is cool. And so I was into that intersection of music and talk. And then when I was at summer camp, when I was 15, I guess, one of the activities that they had, it was a performing arts camp for teenagers, right, in the Berkshires. And they took us to Tanglewood, they did all these things. But one of the activities they had was one of the counselors who worked in radio himself hooked up 2 turntables to the camp PA system and invited people who want to do radio as an activity to be DJs. And I was like, cool, I'll do that, and I brought records with me anyway, because I was into music. And that's it, that kind of got me started. And then when I went to college, I joined the campus radio station and it turned into a career.
Amazing. I mean, it's such a great thing because, I think kids are always thinking, oh, you're sending me to summer camp. You don't know that might end up being the thing you do for your whole life. That's pretty great. So I just want to continue this a little bit, as long as we're talking about summer camp. I mean, you are the truest, bluest New Yorker I think I've ever heard of. You seem to know everything about the city and its politics. Although I saw you did go to Columbus, Ohio for journalism, which is not New York. But just wonder, could you talk a little bit about your upbringing? I know your parents are tuning in today. What were they like? Did you have siblings? And just like, where did this endless curiosity and sense of fairness that comes across in your show, like, where did that come from? Was it from them or was it from your teachers?
Yeah, well, again, that's a very, very kind characterization. And hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. I hope you were able to succeed in logging on to Zoom. But I grew up in a sort of classic East European Jewish derived household. All 4 of my grandparents were immigrants from what was then Poland. Not all of those areas are Poland anymore. And they all came through Ellis Island. They all came with nothing, no money, no education, no English. And both my parents were the first in their families to go to college, both City College. And they brought up me and my brother, who is very renowned in his field. He's the author and designer Warren Lehrer. And, they brought us up with the arts as well as intellectual pursuits. They took us to the theater. Grew up in Queens, but they took us to the theater in the city. They took us to summer stock at Westbury Music Fair and elsewhere, music lessons, art lessons. And, I can remember probably my first political memory is sitting with my mother watching a Nixon Kennedy debate on television. And it definitely made an impression on me. You know, I was very impressed with Kennedy, like an 8-year-old, 7-year-old at that time.
Wow.
Probably would have been between the two of them, most likely. And, you know, so those are a little bit of the roots of maybe where my curiosity came from.
So I don't know if you can see, but in the chat, one of the archivists posted the genealogical lines of the name Lehrer that's in the American Jewish Historical Society records, which is kind of interesting. Maybe you can find some more of your ancestors there. And this is the American Jewish Historical Society. And I wonder, did the fact of being Jewish play a role in your life one way or the other, positively, negatively, neutrally? Like, what did it mean to you growing up?
I think, you know, more subtly than explicitly, in some of the ways that I was just describing. You know, it probably was an expression of Judaism for my parents to raise us in some of the ways that I was saying, even though those are kind of secular pursuits. You know, and they are very culturally identified Jews, not so religious, but I was in, they joined a Reformed congregation. I was bar mitzvahed there in Queens, and, you know, but the Jewish experience is so varied. You know, there are very liberal Jews coming out of the Reform tradition. There are very conservative Jews coming out of the Orthodox tradition. Obviously, you know, there are Jews who are very curious about the outside world. There are Jews who want to be very insular. And so, you know, it's hard to stereotype what's Jewish about my interests, just about like it would be like any other group, individual.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, that's one of the things that we try to do here with the guests. You know, we've had a very wide variety of Jewish guests, but what that means is very individual. And for some people, it's an ethical thing, or like you're saying, maybe more of a cultural thing. Is that how you would look at it? Are there any subjects that you would shy away from because you were Jewish, do you think, like Israel or anything like that? No.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So your show started in 1989, is that right? So that was the same year Rush Limbaugh came on the air. And I guess it feels to me like that was sort of the beginning of Take No Prisoners Radio, which now is led to Take No Prisoners cable TV shows. And yet I feel like you manage in the middle of this pretty hot atmosphere to stay, I don't want to say cool, because you're not, you're very engaged and passionate about what you talk about, but civil, even when you discuss hard topics like Izzy and Eli were saying. You know, you can have guests on that you kind of get the sense you may not be at one with their philosophy, but you manage to do this at a time when this kind of discourse is pretty rare. And I was wondering, has it become harder or easier to do that when you're kind of paddling against the stream?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would pin this mostly on the institution that I work for, that is WNYC as an institution, and public radio in the national context as an institution. And I would tie it all the way back to 1989. I think that, nobody ever told me this, but I think that my show was created along with a number of other public radio talk shows that were being created at stations around the country in big enough cities to have a budget to do this kind of thing, being created somewhat in opposition to how hot and Take No Prisoners talk radio was becoming, Rush Limbaugh and others. And, you know, I've said before that in the way that my show is, the way that my show is different and was at the time that he was alive from Rush Limbaugh is not his political views versus my political views. It's that, like, he used to make a joke. It was half a joke and half not a joke. This show isn't about what you think. It's about what I think, and like I say, half a joke, half not a joke. But our shows on public radio are really not about what I think or what other hosts think. I can bring myself to it. It's not a newscast, it's a talk show. It would be inauthentic if I didn't bring myself to it to some degree. But ultimately, it's with that idea of connection. And it's the public radio ethic. It's the mission, that it was founded in originally and persists to this day, is to be an alternative to whatever the sensationalistic trends of the day are in the commercial media, whether it be hot talk or any other kind of commercial trend.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I also feel, just as a listener, and I also want to tell people who are signed on, and we have a lot of people signed on. If you have any questions you'd like to ask, you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A, I guess. But I guess I do feel that you have that sense of responsibility of almost being a teacher. I've learned a lot honestly, one of my favorite parts of your show are the local politics stuff, because it's not covered that much in most places, unfortunately. If you live in New York, it's really hard to find out what's going on in your neighborhood sometimes. And I feel like so I guess it sounds to me like you feel like that public service part of it is a part of what you're at. Is that right? Or is that?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm aware of as we do segments is sort of the information to opinion ratio. And so even though it's a point of view show where a lot of guests are coming on like you would think of as a talk show, right, with their points of view, with their takes, and then we kick around their takes, the pros and cons, everything. It's also to go in depth with the luxury that we have of lengthy segments, half-hour-ish segments, and give people context. I like stats, I'll do some data crawls sometimes as an introduction to a segment, and we'll take it from there. And WNYC, certainly as New York Public Radio, as the official name of the institution is New York Public Radio. Yes, our mission is to serve New York and vicinity first and foremost. And at a time where, as I'm sure you know, Julie, local news organizations are shrinking or entirely going out of business all over the place. And so one of the things that's happened at our station is over time, well, when I came in 1989, we had 4 people in the newsroom. Now we have dozens of people in the newsroom. And it's partly because the mission, where the station has decided to spend money, as local news has shrunk in local newspapers. And there are some really good local news websites that have sprung up over time, but they're not always very well funded. And so we find local journalism at the heart of our mission, and that certainly extends to my show.
I want to follow up on that in a second, but I just have to tell you, I got a message to you from Carl Levy, your faithful stickball companion.
Oh my goodness.
He's in London and he seems to have known you since you were in Bayside. He said his friend Nancy tipped him off about this. So hello from London. That's kind of cool.
Hi, Carl. Yeah, we live down the block from each other. When we were kids, and I knew, gosh, it's decades ago now, that he had moved to London, and I think he was becoming a college professor, an academic. He was very steeped in current affairs in his own right, even then, and then in history and political science. So, wow, Carl, get in touch.
And then I do have this question before I go back to my questions, but this is a good question from Ralph Seliger, who wanted to know what you did from the time between when you graduated from college and you in the early 70s or sometime in the 70s and then went on the air in the late 80s. What were you doing in that time period?
Right. Well, I was on the air in one way or another that whole time. I went on the air on WNYC in 1989. And yes, I graduated in 73 and immediately was able to get my first radio job that summer. And it was an overnight newscaster job at a Muzak station. And you take what you can get, right? And if you're, committed to trying to break in and do this. And I did that for a few months. And then I got an opportunity as a news director, a minimum wage news director at a tiny AM station in Schenectady, doing morning drive, which is supposed to be prime time in radio. But those were the worst 6 weeks of my life before I said, I cannot take this. Getting to work at 4 o'clock in the morning and being the newsman on, kind of middle of the road music station. So luckily I was able to hop to another station in Albany. This was after I graduated from SUNY at Albany, and these jobs were in Albany. And then I got a job about 2 years out of school at a radio station in Albany, being an FM rock DJ, which is what I really thought I wanted to do at the time, even though I was also interested in news. And when they told me it was a 6-day job, that in addition to my 5-day-a-week evening music show, I had to come in on the weekends and do something. I said, can I come in Sunday night and open the phones from midnight to 3 a.m. And talk about the world? And to my shock, they said yes, because in those days, even music stations needed public affairs credit with the FCC, which they don't need anymore. And they must have thought, well, this is a cheap and easy way to get our public affairs credit. This guy's going to come in and yammer with callers in the middle of the night. But what happened was, after a while, I realized I was putting a lot more mental energy into my once-a-week, middle-of-the-night call-in show than my 5-hour-a-day, 5-day-a-week music show. And that was when I decided to focus on broadcast journalism and go to grad school for journalism, because I did feel sort of underprepared in that respect. And that's how I wound up in Columbus. That was for a grad school in journalism at Ohio State. And my approach to that was, I don't really have money. So I was not going to go to Columbia or Northwestern or apply to those elite schools where I'd have to take out loans. I learned that if you went to kind of a pretty good school, you could, with the experience that I had, you could probably get a TA position, teaching assistant, which comes with free tuition and a little stipend. And Ohio State, which actually was a top 10 journalism school, I think, ranked at the time, was the best of those that I got into. So that's how I wound up near, I guess, your place of art, near your place of origin, which
my place of origin, yes, about 80 miles south of there. So yeah, it must have been pretty alien for you, though.
Well, it was really, it helped satisfy certain aspects, or even spark more of certain aspects of my curiosity about the world. Because one of the things that you must know about Ohio, but that most New Yorkers would not even think to ask the question of, is if you think about where Ohio is geographically. To the right of it on the map is Pennsylvania, which is the great Northeast. To the south of it is Kentucky, right? You must have grown up near Cincinnati,
right,
or in the
near
Athens,
Kentucky,
Ohio, right? So that's right. Cincinnati is the northernmost city in Kentucky. Ha ha ha. And so that's really the South. And Michigan borders it on the north. That's really the North Country. And Indiana borders it on the west. And that's really the Midwest. So at Columbus, where I got to be a teaching assistant, teaching undergraduates radio journalism, they seemed like they were from all over the country because they were from the East, the Midwest, the South, and the North.
That's absolutely right. You got Ohio in a nutshell. That's kind of perfect. So I have to ask you, you always seem so in control of the situation on air, but have you ever lost it when somebody's just been so awful or horrible or something that you just had to say something? Or on the other hand, or maybe, and was there somebody who you just admired so much and they called in and you just like also lost it because you were so choked up or excited?
No, I really am very good at keeping under control, and I can't think of a time when I've lost it, but I think part of the control, if you're doing it right, is you do call people out. I had one just the other day. Let's see, I'm trying to remember what the context was. It was, I don't know, but we were talking about New York. What was the context? I think it might have even been a pre-State of the Union evening special. But somebody called in and said something about, oh yeah, the problem with New York is that, something like those people riot every time a cop asphyxiates a convicted murderer. And I called the guy out for being racist and said, oh, by the way, cops don't asphyxiate convicted anybody's. Cops are coming in contact with people who haven't been convicted of anything yet. Yeah. At least in that encounter. That would only be to them as potential suspects in something. So that's part of the job, is to keep a civil, inviting tone so that we get a lot of people demographically and politically, hopefully, feeling comfortable to call in, comfortable as listeners, comfortable listening to each other and listening to difference, which is a core part of the show. But if somebody's just spreading lies about election fraud or COVID vaccines or spreading racism or anti-Semitism or anything like that, it's part of my job to be present enough to call them out.
And is that part of, does the screening process of people checking in on callers, do they catch a lot of that kind of thing, or is it hard?
Yes, they sure. But and my producers are great, and sometimes interns screen and they get a very fast education in what's out there in the world.
Yeah.
It might actually be a little less shocking in the Twitter era than it was previously. When the show first started, there was no social media yet. And so if somebody was calling in with extreme views or with hate speech, it would be a little shocking for people who weren't used to that kind of expression. Now, I think in a way, it's so much more prevalent that it's probably less shocking. But nonetheless, there are those who will call with a pleasant face to the screener and sneak their way in and then work their mischief. And then it's on me. But the screeners screen out a lot.
Somebody just asked, following up on that, if does the 7-second delay still exist? It does. Yeah. So if somebody says something terrible.
Yeah, we have a 10-second delay, and there are words, goes back to that old George Carlin routine that some of our audience may know, the 7 dirty words you can never say on television. And those rules are still in effect. And if any of those words come up, we are required to hit what's called the dump button, and that'll enact the delay, cut off, a few seconds where that would have been spoken, and then brings us back in. And then we have, we can use our judgment in extreme cases as well. I wouldn't let somebody say the N-word, typically, certainly not if it was said as a smear, as a slur. And so, yes, the delay is in effect. We rarely have to use it. Very rarely have to use it.
Mhm.
And when we do, it's usually by accident. Usually a caller is in the middle of a passionate but well-reasoned and serious-minded thought, and they'll say, and there's that and that, and there's all that shit, and da, 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 and
Whoops, I forgot our 7. We don't have a 7-second, but you can say whatever you want. Well, it's interesting. I was thinking about it, that you were actually being on this kind of a show. You were really interactive before there was interactive. I mean, talk radio was interactivity, but you had to go through a lot of technological changes, like the podcast now. Does that take extra work for you to put the podcast together? Or is it really just an encapsulation of the show?
It takes, a certain amount. Certainly we have to program for the media of today, and live radio, whether it's on the AM and FM bands or whether it's live streaming. A lot of people listen live on their phones now, and other devices. And so there's live and there's on demand with podcasts, or just listening to the show later on the website that didn't exist. And so we've been through different iterations of, well, how much do we try to make it both? And where we've landed pretty much is we always lean into being live. If we are broadcasting at 11:15 and there's something that's going on that moment and it's breaking, we're gonna say it, and we're gonna really seem live. And then we do put out an edit every day, called Brian Lehrer, a Daily Politics Podcast. That's our national politics segment each day. And that's a podcast that's targeted at a national audience, but it's edited. So the references that would be dated get taken out. And I pay a little more attention to how not to ruin it, as we're going along. But so, there's all of that. And it's good to live in the multiplicity of media forms today, because there's just so much more opportunity for people to hear our show, like hear anything. And it also goes to who the competition is, right? It used to be, in the old days, the competition was other radio stations on AM and FM. Now the competition is everything in the world that's audio that ever exists.
So to follow up on that, somebody had asked, do you listen to other podcasts or other radio programs? Because if you have to listen to everything in the world, is it better just not to listen to anything? I mean, is there anything that you follow faithfully or at all?
Well, I'm always sort of following my notes. And so, like in the, again, in the old pre-internet days, it was much easier to read in. I would look at the major New York dailies primarily, and there was enough national as well as local content, national and international as well as local content, that was my daily reading. And in the news magazines and opinion journals, like The Nation on the left and National Review on the right, but that was easy enough. And then now there's just there are so many feeds, so many streams of information. It's easy to get overwhelmed. So what do you do first? Well, sometimes Twitter is my first stop in the morning. Just because we follow many journalists and news organizations and commentators, right? So let me see what people are talking about from this group that we follow, who would be news-based. And, and then I'm certainly reading official, news sources as well. But sometimes following my nose just means, let's see what people on Twitter are talking about of the kinds of things we might discuss on the show. And then I'll read into the sources that they are linking to, whether they be print or audio or video or whatever.
Interesting. I mean, I really appreciated the other day when you were talking about Nikki Haley and you had that journalist on from South Carolina. It was really great to get that, local perspective on her. But, because this is going on very quickly somehow, I did want to talk to you about something that when I had listened to you talk at some point about what it was like at WNYC during 9/11, because you guys were downtown and having that happen, it was so incredible to think of everything we all went through, but then to also have to report on it. But I was wondering, when the pandemic started, which was such a different kind of disaster, but in some ways, even bigger in some ways. I wonder what that was like for you in your job, especially you with a background in science and so on. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Right, background in public health. I
Public
had,
health.
In addition to the master's in journalism, over time after that master's in journalism, I had been developing a reporting specialty in health and environmental issues. I had gotten really interested in those and did go back for a master's in that subject area. And so I had some grounding in public health. The first thing that happened was that engineers from the station came to my apartment and set up a broadcast studio on my dining room table.
Wow.
But it was magic, again, talk about changing technology. Not that many years ago, that would have been impossible, or the best way that I could have gotten on to the station's transmitters was by phone with telephone quality. Now, you just plug this device called the Comrex into my Ethernet port, and you've got studio quality sound, coming out of your dining, and or a dining alcove in my apartment's case, and and I felt like I always felt grounded at the beginning of the pandemic in knowing what our job was. Like I knew that people needed a lot of scientific information as it was coming out, but it was also new about the pandemic. People needed information, a lot of advice. We did a lot of advice segments on how to cope if you're not going out. And that's different people with different kinds of needs. If you were a teenager or a young adult with a tremendous amount of desire to go socialize, that would be one thing. If you were an elderly person who was really at risk from the virus, but didn't know how to get food into your house because you weren't used to ordering for delivery from the internet or whatever, there were all those threads, the medical thread, the day-to-day getting by a thread, the isolation that people were experiencing. And so one of our roles was as kind of a hub for people just to hear other people. So all of that.
Well, it's interesting. Just as you were talking, somebody wrote into the chat that said, your show got me through the early months of the pandemic. So many times conversations on your shows then led to some seriously cathartic tears. Thank you. And I felt that as well. I mean, I think for a lot of people, just that calmness is it's you have many gifts, but that's a huge gift to people when everybody feels like panicking, I think. And the news, unfortunately, is geared up to make us feel a little panicky. So thank you for that. Do you broadcast now from the studio or from home usually?
From home.
Oh, you
from home
do?
usually, yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, a number of our people do. And the show, I'm very COVID conservative for one thing personally, but also, if the show is really suffering from that, I have a different set of decisions. But by all our usual measures, it hasn't at all.
No.
And, and anyway, we have very few studio guests, the opposite of some other shows, even on our station, where they're booking way in advance, where they're not linked to the news cycle, right? So for us, we're trying to get people so linked to what's going on right now that the overwhelming majority of our guests are by phone, or by Zoom, or by other remote technologies, even before the pandemic.
Huh.
It wasn't so much Zoom before the pandemic, but it was Skype, which is similar.
So do you do the interviews on Zoom? Are you seeing people when you're talking to them usually?
Usually not.
Usually not.
Usually not. Sometimes people really like it, and then I do it. We had a guest recently who was hard of hearing, so he was, a journalist, and he speaks fine, but he's hearing impaired, and he wanted to be able to see my lips move.
Huh. Oh, that's so great.
And so we Zoomed for him. But one of the reasons that I've never cared that much about being in person, having guests in studio, is that I feel like I am a representative for the listeners who are having an audio only experience. And so if I'm not, and this can cut both ways, because there are other hosts, who I admire and respect, who feel like they're going to get more out of their guests if they've got the eye contact and that body language, which of course is real. But I also feel like something can get lost between the host and the guest in that then doesn't get transmitted. And if I'm having an audio only experience, like I do like to talk to people on the phone anyway, and that I'm really even more in a certain way a representative of the audience, and I'm going to give them the best audio experience they can possibly have.
And I really think you do that. We're at 2:15, but do you have a couple of more minutes, or do you have to?
Sure.
Okay, great. So this is a question many people have been wondering, which is, just tell us about one. It doesn't have to be the favorite one, but a favorite interview, and what made it so great.
Favorite interview is hard because there are so many categories, So here's what I'll give you in that realm. I'm going to give you a favorite all-time celebrity caller. And it was a long time ago. And here I am all these decades later, and saying my favorite, most memorable caller was in 1992 on Martin Luther King Day. We had an author, James Cone, who had written a book comparing Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And who calls in? Arthur Ashe. And I was absolutely flummoxed. For one thing, I'm a tennis fan. I was a tennis fan. So I was, like, oh my God, Arthur Ashe at that level, but also very, very aware of his human rights work. And I was like, oh my God, Arthur Ashe is calling in. And then he stayed with us for 10 minutes on the phone and told his own stories of being a college student and being more into Martin and having roommates and friends who were more into Malcolm, and, the debates that they would have at that time. And I just felt so honored to be a listener to Arthur Ashe and the fact that he was listening to the show. And then as it turned out, he was calling from his hospital bed. He had AIDS, and he died only a few weeks later. And I realized that we were one of his last public appearances.
Oh my God.
But I wasn't thinking about that at all during the phone call. I was just thinking, oh my God, Arthur Ashe listens to my show, and here he is calling and being extremely wise and eloquent. And, sometimes they say, don't meet your heroes because they'll always disappoint you. Well, he lived up to and exceeded any expectations I could have had.
So, okay, I'm really sad that we have to end this, but I will say, I can say that same exact thing now. You're one of my heroes. I think you're like amazing on the radio. My husband said, don't be a fangirl, but I am. And I'm proud to say it. And I really appreciate this, that you took the time. I know you had to work today, and just really appreciate it. And we're just getting a flood of happy people who really appreciate that you took your time today to talk to us about you instead of somebody else. So thank you.
Thank you, Julie. It was wonderful to talk.
Bye-bye.
And thanks to everybody.